Good morning for those of you on the West Coast. Good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast, and good early evening to those of you from the UK. Welcome, welcome. Bienvenidos a todos. It's so good to have you with us for our third and final part in a wonderful series with Senior Rabbi Joseph Dweck, exploring Sephardic Judaism in the modern era. It's such an honor to have Rabbi Dweck with us the past 3 weeks, and I hope you've enjoyed his presence with us as much as I have. Just a reminder, this is through our Sephardic Digital Academy initiative with a host of wonderful other programs as well on Sephardic Torah, Halakha, Sephardic language, Ladino, Sephardic cooking, and so much more. If you're interested in learning more about our other programs, please check out our website at sephardicbrotherhood.com. At the end of this program, we're also going to enter into the chat a brief survey asking for 2 or 3 minutes of quick feedback. We always appreciate this after the end of a series, just so that we can improve in the future and find new ideas for future topics that we always appreciate hearing from all of you. One other note I'll make is that we are in the midst of our end of the year giving campaign. If you can give, if you're willing to give, we would greatly appreciate it. This is a nonprofit initiative. We are a nonprofit, and we appreciate any support you can give us at this difficult time. With that, it's always an honor and privilege to introduce Rabbi Joseph Dweck, the senior rabbi of the S&P Sephardi community of the UK, who's a world-renowned scholar of Judaism and insights on Jewish philosophy. Rabbi Dweck, whenever you're ready, bechavod.
Thank you, Ethan. And it's really, I really want to, oh, wait, am I unmuted? I'm unmuted, right? Yeah.
Okay. No, you're good.
I'm good. I want to say just, what an honor it's been to be able to share with this wonderful group and with the Brotherhood, and to get to know the Brotherhood more, to be able to speak with you and to hear about the amazing work that the Brotherhood is doing. And I'm very honored to be able to have the opportunity to share with everyone. And I thank you for those who have been here, with me for the last 2 installments, and for those who are here for the third. We're going to round it out tonight, or it's not tonight, is it? As you can see behind me, it's tonight over here. But I realize that where you are, it's probably the sun has yet to set. So to recap, again, it's not even a recap, but just kind of like reorient ourselves in terms of the trajectory. The first talk that we looked at very early origins of differences in terms of the Jewish people, just in terms of approach. And we actually went as far back as to Joseph and his brothers and to Yaakov and his relationship with his children, in terms of how it was that they engaged with the world and what it was that they saw about the manner of engagement of Israel, of the nation of Israel, with the world. And then it wasn't a nation, it was just a family. We are a familial nation, but there was tremendous difference in terms of how it is that they understood the way that we should engage with the world. And we examined that in the first installment. In the second, we looked at Spain, we looked at Harambam, we looked at the nature of the Torah of the Andalusia, especially how it was that Harambam understood things, and we focused specifically on him and his teachings and what it was that he taught and how he came through, and ultimately the legacy that he leaves us. And so we looked at the idea that Harambam teaches us that the way to know God, and that there is an obligation in Judaism, in the nation of Israel, to know God, and that the way to know God is through studying the world that he created, and that it is to know him is to love him. And the more that one knows, the more that one loves. And that has always been central to the nature of Sephardi thought and experience. And so what that means is we recognize the world not as some would suggest an elaborate distraction from what it is that we are supposed to be doing, not as this massive challenge to us in terms of how it is that we're supposed to be living our lives and how well we can keep from it, but to the contrary. It is a place that we are to dive into, to experience, to study, and through it to understand. Misha Amar Vehaya Ha'olam, as Harambam quoted Rabbi Meir, to understand the one who spoke and created the world. And the way that he expresses himself is through the world. And so we recognized and indicated that that does not mean that there are not toxins in this world that are not fit for us to completely consume. And so the Torah is our lens through which we see this world, determine and judge this world, and understand how it is that we're supposed to engage with this world. It is the Torah that signals for us those toxins and how it is that we are supposed to manage them. What I'd like to do with you in this final installment, in the third treatment of our thought, around this, is to look at how does this land for us as Faradim in this time, right, in the 21st century. And in order to be able to look at it in the 21st century, being that we are at the very beginnings of the 21st century, we have to look at the 20th century, which most of us remember, and understand what happened in modern recent history to the Sfaradim. So much of that has to do with three major things, right? It has to do with the Enlightenment that occurred in Europe. It has to do with the Holocaust, which decimated our people. And it has to do with the establishment of the State of Israel, which very much changed the game for so much of our nation, for essentially the entire nation. It is something that we cannot, as Jews, pretend isn't there, or afford, or even have the option to look away from. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to look at those three elements and understand how they intertwined in order to be able to affect us as Faradim today. The Enlightenment that started in the 18th century. Well, it didn't start. I mean, if we're going to say start, we could look at underpinnings starting way before that. But its effect, its impact in the 18th century was profound and far-reaching, and it posed tremendous challenge to the Jews that were living in Europe. Tremendous challenge to the old systems of life. I mean, it posed challenge to the entire Western world, but to the state of religion, in which through this Enlightenment, through our developments of understanding of science and our advances in philosophical thought, the assumptions of the nature of reality that went so far as to actually undermine and shake the foundations of God, of religious life, of those imperatives in the West, of course, shook our foundations just as much, if not more. In Jewish communities that lived in Europe, essentially in ghettos, it was profoundly jarring, because as it was, we were living in these ghettos isolated from what was going on outside of them. And when I want to be clear and say that, the Jews who lived in ghettos did not necessarily choose to live in those ghettos originally. The outside was hostile to Jewish life in many of the areas in Europe. And again, I always feel that I have to qualify whatever it is that I'm saying, especially when I'm talking historically and how it is that these things manifest in a people. We are talking essentially in an hour. I am talking about things in very broad strokes. And so I want to lay that out, right? That, the ideas that I'm putting out here are extremely broad strokes, right? They are the general treatments of these ideas, but there's no question about the fact that the details, that the intricacies of it have yet to be unpacked, or can be, of course, unpacked. What I'm offering and suggesting are the trends that essentially set the broad structure of where it is that we find ourselves today. So the Enlightenment shook very much the Ashkenazi world, what we call now in its Jewish form the Haskalah. It shook the Ashkenazi world, and the Ashkenazi world responded to it in different ways. Western Europe didn't respond to it in the same way that Eastern Europe did. The whole development of the Reform movement came out as a result of the Enlightenment and its effects. But because the Ashkenazim, for the most part, until the Enlightenment hit, were studying mainly Torah, were writing mainly in Hebrew, and isolating, for all intents and purposes, away from Gentile society or outside society. When the Enlightenment came in and restructured the known world in terms of how it is that human beings were relating to it, and the paradigms in which the mind in the Western world was thinking, it shook terribly the Ashkenazi world, because they had not essentially related to what was going on outside. They didn't really need to, because things were just different modes of parochial thought, and they were religiously based. So you were able to, as an Ashkenazi Jew, say, look, you have your religion and we have our religion. You do your things and we do our things. But there wasn't this complete feeling of sailing away, of floating away from the nature of reality itself. The nature of reality and how it worked in the ancient world was shared. Yeah, and when I say ancient, I'm talking about the early medieval world, the early Middle Ages. It was essentially shared. How it was that the world worked, the manner in which we understood things, that was shared. Which God we prayed to, that was different. The mode of our religious behavior, that was different. But not the ideas around which the world was structured. That paradigm shifted. And when that paradigm shifted, it created massive rupture in the Ashkenazi Jewish world. And to the point that there were, in Germany, there was the thought that in order to be able to keep our feet in reality, we need to reform Judaism. And so what that meant was that the world was shifting to a degree in which the gaps between our understanding of the world through the lens of Torah and our relationship to the world as it was coming to be known was widening. The gaps were widening. And we needed to decide what it was that we were going to do. And because the Ashkenazim were not used to looking at the world through the lens of Torah, but rather sufficing with studying Torah and only Torah, and being able to live in their world only in terms of how it was that Torah defined things, the situation was dire, because they were not used to looking at reality through the lens of Torah. And so we have to consider that. And that's also one of the reasons why Reform Judaism emerged from Western European Jewry, because since there was not this tradition or regularity in terms of looking at the world through the lens of the Torah, there was no alternative but to change the Torah in order to be able to fit the world, rather than looking at it as a set of principles. With regards to the Sephardim in the West, the Sephardim who were living in England and in Amsterdam and so on, it was not so much of a rupture. It was more of a tremor. And that was because there was a familiarity with adapting our lives as Jews to where it was that the world was going, and that we didn't see it necessary to have to compromise our Judaism in order to be able to live in the world as it was. Again, that's a very general statement. How exactly that occurred is something that needs to be and should be discussed and understood. And yes, it is true that that also meant that there was a level of religiosity that was challenged among the Sephardim. Till this day, the Sephardim of the Western and classical approach do not ask or accept or reject, perhaps is a better term, a member of the community based on the level of their adherence to the law. All that we expect is that when the law is to be questioned, or when law must apply to our lives, that the law is applied in its orthodox normative approach, or in the classical approach. But in our synagogues, we didn't develop systems, or we didn't develop separations and delineations between this kind of Jew that adheres to and doesn't adhere to this belief or that belief. We looked at ourselves as one. We recognized that within ourselves there were different levels of approach, that there was an authority as far as the Rav or the Hacham and the Torah and how it was that it was done officially in synagogue, but we embraced everyone, and we do that until today in many of our synagogues and ways, although that is beginning to change, and we'll talk about that towards the end. Because of that, the Enlightenment was, I say, more of a tremor than it was a rupture for the Sephardic Jews. But that has to do with the West. The problem is that the Enlightenment didn't really reach the East in any significant way. There was some effects of the Enlightenment, in terms of the French and their presence among, our communities in the Eastern lands and the Arab lands. But for the most part, the Enlightenment didn't touch the East. And so because of that, the Sephardim who lived in those regions in the Middle East and in North Africa didn't have to deal with the Enlightenment, didn't face the challenge of the Enlightenment, and therefore were able to carry on with their lives in the East as they had been up until that point, and they carried on all the way into the 20th century, living, writing, thinking in the way that they always had done before the Enlightenment hit the West. And so you can see this in the writings. You can see this in the writings of so many of the Sephardim, that they were not raising the issues that were coming up in the Western world because of enlightened thought, which is fine as long as you are left in the East. Yeah, and when I say fine, I say that, of course, with a caveat. I mean fine in terms of the jarring experience of it. I mean, at the end of the day, the world needs to be able to come to terms with the enlightenment of humanity, wherever it is on the globe that humanity experiences it. But as far as the Sephardim were concerned in the East, they hadn't really been hit by the Enlightenment. So the Western Sephardim were dealing with it, but were not experiencing massive rupture. The Ashkenazim were experiencing rupture because of it, and there was many different approaches, everything from Reform Judaism to Hasidism. And the Eastern Jews, the Sephardim in the East, were not really impacted deeply by the light of the Enlightenment. The Holocaust, of course, is a massive catastrophe for our people, and it decimates entire communities, entire countries, and as a result of that, the trauma, and even to use the word trauma for such an occurrence it's just not even strong enough to be able to properly treat it. But the trauma of the Holocaust all but broke us as a nation. And we felt that, more than felt, we experienced the consistency of our tradition. And when I say our, I'm not talking about Sephardim specifically here, I'm talking about Jews in general, was cut. And so where we will have, as Jews in our various countries, villages, communities, learned so much about the nature of our Judaism through mimetic experience, what Professor Joseph Soloveitchik, no, why am I forgetting his first name? I forget the first name. Professor Rabbi Joseph Dweck's son, Professor Soloveitchik, called mimetic transmission, in which it isn't through academic teaching or through textually based instruction, but through behavior, through experience, through learning of culture and the milieu around which we grow and live, by watching. Thank you, Chaim. Thank you. Chaim Soloveitchik, yes. Through the culture in which we live, through watching our parents and grandparents, through listening to the tunes, through seeing and hearing the pronunciations, through watching the behaviors. That is what he terms mimetic tradition. That was completely destroyed by the Holocaust. And what that created for the Ashkenazim was a frantic need to rebuild what we would call an ud mutzal me'esh, the embers that were left from the massive fires of the Holocaust. And so that occurred in many ways. There was this, for those who were able to come out and ended up in the United States or in Israel, the land of Israel, trying to rebuild, but to rebuild without that consistency of tradition and line. And therefore, there needed to be this almost not just a rebuilding, but a reconstructing of Jewish thought and life and approach. And what Professor Soloveitchik suggests, and I believe that there's great substance in that suggestion, is, and I don't need to say that I believe it. I mean, he wrote it quite some time ago, and there's been a great deal of discussion around it. But nonetheless, substantive is that the restructuring, the reconstructing occurred around what it was that we had from our texts. We had to look back at what was written and to interpret it in the way that we experienced and understood it in those times, without the consistent tradition of watching it in actual play among our parents and grandparents and our communities and societies. There was a frantic attempt to rebuild Europe in Israel and in the United States, in which you will find among the Ashkenazim, you do not find this among the Sephardim, that the yeshivot that were built were called after the cities of Europe. To call Yeshiva Panovich was unthinkable for Sephardim, not because we didn't live in Panovich, we didn't call our yeshivot Halab or Baghdad. We didn't do those things. We didn't aim at restructuring or reconstructing entire civilizations, but one of the reasons perhaps for that is, I mean, what one might say is because we didn't experience them completely decimated, because we were able to take with us our parents and grandparents for the most part. We were able to take with us our minhagim, and that line was able to come through with us for most of us, maybe not all of us. But the Ashkenazim didn't have that. And so there was definitely a frantic attempt in order to be able to reconstruct. And so that occurs. That occurs in the United States, and that occurs in Israel. And with the establishment of the state of Israel by Western Jews, Israel, for all intents and purposes, became a Western country. I think that that's extremely important for us to understand, right? So that even though it was situated in the Middle East and we were eating falafel and hummus, nonetheless, the government, the governing structure was established on Western terms. It was taken from the British Mandate. Until this day, Israeli secular law is based on the British system. And for all intents and purposes, the founders of the state were Western Jews, Western Ashkenazi Jews, who, I will say outright, looked down on the Eastern Jews. And saying look down is a soft way of putting it. There was absolute racism and prejudice among the Ashkenazim who established the state of Israel. And they looked at the Sephardim, they looked at the Eastern Sephardim of that place, and those who came from the Eastern Arab lands as unsophisticated, uneducated, unenlightened, uncouth. And as wrong as it was to think that way and to treat the Sephardim, the Eastern Sephardim, right? And I'm using Sephardim in a very broad sense in this discussion, right? As such, they shouldn't have looked at them or treated them in the heinous ways that they did. And I'm sorry that I'm saying it so strongly, but there were some serious crimes that were committed. I mean serious crimes that were committed as a result of that prejudice. In the United States, it wasn't as severe because they didn't have as much control, but there was still that feeling of the Sephardim who had come into the West as being other and as not rating as part of the Jewish people. One of the major reasons for this was not just because of basic prejudice. Whether it wasn't just because of looking at the other as other and not accepting the other. There was more to it. And I want to be clear that in what I'm about to say, in no way endorse, validate, or justify the manner in which the Ashkenazim treated the Sephardim and the Mizrahi Jews that came from Arab lands, North Africa, the Mediterranean, and so on. But it does look at the intensity towards the prejudice, or that underlied the prejudice. Because the Sephardim never experienced the Enlightenment, And because they did not live in the West, remember, the Ashkenazim, for them, the United States of America was the new world. It was a new, strange country, but it was the West. It wasn't that different from Europe. It was that different from the Middle East. It was a completely different paradigm of life. And what that meant for so many Sephardim who came into the West was that, as we would say in Hebrew or in Lashon Gemara, lo matz'u yedehem veraglehem bebet midrash. They just did not find themselves having a context within which they could live confidently. So when they came into the New World, it wasn't like the Ashkenazim coming into the New World. The Ashkenazim were coming into a new country, a young country, but a Western country. Our ancestors were coming into a country that was so foreign, where the mores and views and paradigms were so foreign and so far developed that we really did not know how to be able to establish ourselves and insert ourselves in a seamless way within Western society. That's happening in America and the like. In Israel, you have now a government that is run by Western secular Jews that look at the indigenous Sephardi Jews that are there and those that come in from the Arab lands, both in 48 and 67 and every time in between, as being basically heathen, not heathens, but triple class, third class citizens at best. And the seed of that experience was that we, the Sephardim, had been completely untouched by the Enlightenment. When I say completely untouched, yes, I know the Alliance came. But fundamentally, we were not changed by it. We were not shaken by it. And so this is what happened as a result of that. As a result of the Ashkenazim looking down at us, looking at us as though we were not sophisticated enough to live in any meaningful way integrated into society, they A, did not attempt to integrate into society, and B, to the contrary, they kept us as separate as possible. But secondly, the experience of seeing the Sephardim that way, who essentially the Ashkenazim would have said were unenlightened, meant that the Sephardim began to develop a sense of self-consciousness. And that's a problem. And that became a very serious problem. Because as a result of that self-consciousness, there was a development among the Sephardim to try and integrate. And in many circles, the attempt to integrate meant doing Judaism like the Ashkenazim. And so we, the Sephardim, didn't begin to open yeshivot that taught in the way that we normally would have taught in our homelands. Why that was could be multifaceted, but we didn't. We had Porat Yosef in Israel, and then various other yeshivot that opened up, but that tended to match their curriculum to the Ashkenazi yeshivot, and still never really rated with the Ashkenazi yeshivot, if they did open them. And that was in order to be able to be accepted into society, into the religious aspect of society anyway. In the United States, there was not a sense of an acceptance among the Ashkenazi Jews that were there. And much of that had to do with the sheer number. The Ashkenazim outnumbered the Sephardim, and so they were the majority. But there was definitely a feeling of self-consciousness, of our way is not a way that we see happening out there. And I don't know if anybody has experienced this, to the Sephardim that are in the audience. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, in which when you might share a custom of yours, where you might share an approach of yours around your Jewish life or Jewish practice to an Ashkenazi, that they might look at it, or will have tended to look at it, as being completely foreign, almost as though not even registering as Jewish. And I might be exaggerating a touch, but not very much. I've experienced it on countless occasions. I'll tell you a story just to give you an example. And this is an innocent story. I might have even told this story. I don't remember if I told it here or I told it in another lecture. When the state was established, Hacham Ezra Atiyeh, Zecher Tzadik Libracha, who was Halabi, who was living in Israel, he was the Rosh Yeshiva Porat Yosef. He was the Rav of Hacham Ovadia, Hacham Ovadia Yosef. He encouraged Hacham Ovadia, was a young man at the time, to come to a meeting to speak with the Stipler and Rav Shach. Rav Shach also was a young man at the time. Excuse me, not the Stipler, the Chazon Ish. Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish and Rav Shach had met with Rav Chacham Ezra Atiyeh and Chacham Ovadia. Why did they meet? They were talking about beginning a political party. This was in the very early days. And they sat down to talk, and Chacham Ezra Atiyeh was speaking in Hebrew. And the Chazon Ish said, we're not speaking in Hebrew. Mama Loshen. We have to speak in Yiddish. And because Chacham Ezra Atiyeh did not speak in Yiddish, the meeting was adjourned. And they did not even begin to discuss anything because they didn't speak in Yiddish. And now, why am I telling you that story? You could say, okay, listen, maybe it was easier for him to converse in Yiddish. He didn't want to open and so on and so forth. I had a high school Rebbe. I went to Eula, right? One of my high school Rebbes, so the LA people know Eula. And one of my high school Rebbes was talking to me about Chacham Ovadia. And he said, of course, Chacham Ovadia, Rabbi Ovadia speaks Yiddish. I said, no, he doesn't. He doesn't speak Yiddish. And he said, well, how does he speak to the Gedolim? And it wasn't meant when it was said to me, in any negative way. But I realized that there is no sense whatsoever of an alternative in Jewish life and Jewish thought in their mind. And that has been my experience through much of my life. Now, when I say my experience in much of my life, I'm talking for me as me in my life. I don't know what your experience was, but if I had to bet, I would say that the likelihood is that your experience as a Sephardi in one way or another would have been met up with in some similar way. Not that when you share your custom, the response is, oh, that's interesting, but rather, that's what you do. How do you not do this? Right? When I tell people that we don't say Netane Tokef in our Yamim Noraim, right, Ashkenazim, that we don't have it. It's not in our liturgy. They look like, well, then how do you have Yamim Noraim? And I just think, well, I'm sorry, but, I don't have it. And I'm sorry for you that you don't have the poems of Rabbi Shlomo ben Gabirol that are the most uplifting, soaring poetry of our people. Now, when I say all of this to you, I'm not saying this to kind of like rally the troops and fight against the oppression by any way, by any means. The only reason that I present this is because it is important for us to be able to be aware, first of all, of what happened. And I am not saying that it is all the fault of the Ashkenazim. I'm not saying that. I'm looking at it more in an objective way and saying, we missed the Enlightenment. And that had far-reaching implications for us. We struggled and still do to a certain degree struggle with self-consciousness around how we live our Jewish lives. Not among our own family, of course, but in the greater Jewish world. There is a sense of self-consciousness, maybe not for you, but for your children, for your grandchildren. Our desire is to conform. It's a human social desire. And it takes a great deal of strength to be able to hold one's own way, one's own identity as a valid, legitimate, deeply rooted, meaningful way. Our way, like I said, was to embrace the world and to find God within it. The problem was that the Enlightenment didn't hit us, so we didn't have the experience of having to now look at a world that was an enlightened world through the lens of Torah. And so there were very few Sephardim who did that. There were some Sephardim in the West who did. You have people like Chacham Shaul Mortera, who was the Rebbe of Spinoza in Amsterdam. He didn't know how to answer Spinoza, unfortunately, but he was brilliant. You read his dirashot, which are printed, and you see that he was dealing with a very different congregation in Amsterdam than perhaps his Middle Eastern counterparts were dealing with. You look at Chacham David Nieto, my predecessor, who was the rabbi in England of Bevis Marks in 1701. He wrote Mateh Dan to show the validity of rabbinic Judaism and its roots. He had conversations, philosophical discussions with the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was a doctor. He was a philosopher. He was a polymath. You have people like, again, I know that I've been questioned around that, but Chacham Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, was from Italy, Padua, who ended up living in Amsterdam, who wrote morality plays, which were in vogue at the time, in order to be able to teach the Torah to the people. You had that in the West. You had that early, back in the times of Harambam, before the Enlightenment. But our way has always been to embrace the world and the discoveries of the world. And as the Hachamim say, Chochmah b'goyim ta'amin. You start to see wisdom sprouting among the nations of the world, believe it, learn it, understand it. It's not Torah. We have to understand it through the lens of Torah, but we need to be able to experience it, learn it, and understand it, because it's that way that we come to understand God, come to know God. And so, what do I suggest for our current circumstance nowadays? My suggestion is that our tradition and our way is still our tradition and our way. On the one hand, we have to embrace Torah. We have to know Torah. We have to encourage our children to study Torah. That doesn't mean that all of our children will be scholars of the Torah or rabbis or hachamim or what have you, but those that can, should. But they should study the Torah with the embrace of the world. And that's not just Torah im derech eretz, as the Ashkenazim would have it. It's not study Torah and make sure that you study derech eretz too, the secular subjects. What we say is study Torah and see Torah as a lens for the entire world. Let the Torah become the lens that one sees through which one sees the entire world. And study everything as an expression of God. So people have no problem. Oh yeah, we'll study science, right? That people tend to be more open to. Why? Well, God created the world, so if I study science, I start to understand the world. Yeah, but then my question is, should you not study psychology? I mean, who created the human mind? Is that not God? Our observations about the nature of human thought. Should you not study philosophy? The explorations of ideas. should you not study literature, the arts, the productions of the human mind, of which God created? Are there toxins? Yes. Are we meant to see those things through the lens of Torah? Yes. But it also means that it's our responsibility to educate our people in that vein. And for that matter, anyone else in the nation of Israel who wishes to learn in that way. There is no prejudice in this. There is no, this is only our way, anybody who isn't Sephardi, get out. To the contrary, this is our way. And like my friend, Professor Tzvi Zohar said, to keep Sephardic thought and tradition only to Sephardim is like keeping Shakespeare only to Englishmen. It's something that's beautiful and should be taught. And so I hope that I'm not being too convoluted in how it is that I'm presenting this. And that there's a recognition that as a result of a tremendous amount of self-consciousness around having missed an experience that was experienced by our Ashkenazi brothers and sisters, and therefore feeling inadequate as a result of it, even though we didn't necessarily have to, we lost our way a bit. We allowed for ourselves to mimic what our brothers and sisters, the Ashkenazim, were doing in order that we should gain acceptance. And what I'm saying, number one, is that is not necessary, because our tradition is real and valuable, and it's ours, and it belongs to us, and we should be proud of it. But we need to move it into the 21st century. We no longer live in the Arab lands, in the Middle East. I mean, unless you're moving to Dubai or, something like that in the next few days. But even there is not an area that isn't influenced by the West and Western thought. We are, you and I, for the most part, and certainly our children, we're Western. And we need to understand the West on our terms, not on how our brothers and sisters, the Ashkenazim, understood it, on our terms, through our tradition, in our way. That's what I aim to do, and how it is that I teach, and how I have set up my Batei Midrash. And so if there is one thing that I teach, the overarching idea is that it is best to teach principles. That is what we need to do today. We need to teach principles of thought. We need to teach principles of Torah. How does the Torah relate? How does the Torah approach the various aspects of life in the world? Teach it in terms of principles rather than detailed data points. It's one of the reasons why I love Harambam. It's one of the reasons why I love the Ramchal, why I teach them all the time, because that's how they taught. Harambam wrote at the end of his Perusha Mishnah of Masechet Berachot, in Masechet Berachot, the end of Masechet Berachot in his Perusha Mishnah, he says, Tov be'anai, it is good for me, le'med davar me'ikarei adat, to teach you a fundamental principle of the nature of our Torah, mikol davar asher alamed, from anything else that I will ever teach you. And he taught everything on Rambam. But he's saying to you, it's more valuable for me to teach principles than to teach anything else. The Ramchal writes at the opening of the Derech Hashem, which he wrote in Amsterdam when he was there, Le'olam, yu devrei Torah biyadecha kelalim. Let the words of the Torah forever be principles in your hands. Why, he says? Because when you learn data points, if the principles are clear, you know how to appropriate the data points. You know where they should be categorized and how they interrelate. But if all you've got is a bunch of data, well, then what? How is that supposed to come together to form a lens through which one is supposed to see the world? So if the overarching principle is the author of the Torah is the author of the world, and there should be no contradictions, then everything sets back from there. I recognize that the world is not an elaborate distraction, but an elaborate expression of God. That my way to know God is to study that world and all aspects of it. That my way to love God is to be able to embrace the world, not to run away from it. And that essentially our approach to life is at the center. That's the third point. Again, number one, the author of the Torah is the author of the world, and there are no contradictions. Number two, the way that I engage in this life is to see the world as an elaborate expression of God. And therefore, I study all aspects of it. And I use Torah, I study my Torah and form Torah as a lens for that approach. And third, our approach, this approach of the Sephardim, has traditionally been center. Find center. Refrain from extremes. Why? I'll tell you why. Because here's the thing about extremes, and with this I will close. And then if there are questions, I'll answer. Here's the thing about extremes. When one lives in extremes, either right or left, whatever you attribute the right or left to, you have in effect shut down thought. Why have you shut down thought? Because I guarantee you, you take any extreme, political extremes, religious extremes, social extremes, and you give any event or any subject or any issue, and you will be able to predict how either extreme is going to respond to that issue. Why? Toe the party line. But to actually examine each issue, to examine each experience, to examine each circumstance and situation, and judge it from a place of thought and reason, only occurs at the center. Because it's balanced. Because it doesn't assume that a particular outcome needs to happen. In this case, I might be lenient. In this case, I might be stringent. In this case, I might be liberal. In this case, I might be conservative. In this case, because of these situations, I might refrain. In this case, because of these situations, I might engage. Thought, reason. And why is that important? Not just because it sounds good. Because, and this is what I'm going to ask everybody to, if you have floated away from me while I'm talking, come back to me here and now. Why is the center and reason thought so important? Real responsiveness? Because if my ultimate desire is to know God, it means that my desire is to be invested in reality, because God is the ultimate reality. And to the degree that I know reality is the degree that I am open to connecting to God. And that is our ultimate purpose. Nothing else. Do any of us know reality emphatically? No. But the endeavor of our lives is to approximate reality and get it as close to what is real as possible. That is at the heart. And like I said, as far as the Sephardim have been concerned, to know the world is to know God. That's what Harambam taught us. That's what our Hachamim taught us. And that's what we endeavor to do through the lens of Torah. So again, as I close, I feel that I have left the situation in such broad strokes, but perhaps it's better to open it up and to treat it rather than to be silent around it, and to allow for there to be further explanation as we move ahead. But this is the idea and how it is that I see things now in the 21st century. And what we need to do in the 21st century is to be vigilant as ever with the study of our Torah, but to be able to see it and study it as a lens through which to study our whole world. And with that, I will end, and I'll open for any questions if there are. And I thank you for your patience and your attention.
Rabbi Dweck, Hazak Baruch, as always, for your wonderful class and wonderful series. We're going to open up the floor to questions. If you have questions, please put them into the chat. We see a few already. Before we do, I'm going to just post very quickly, first, the link to our community survey, and the second, the link to donate if you're interested in supporting our work at the Sephardic Brotherhood. Rabbi Dweck, do you see some of the questions in the chat already, or should I read them
think
out?
so, but I think so. I have most of the questions in the chat are sent privately to me, which is fine. But yeah, I can answer them. Yeah. Let me see over here. So yes, from Yafa Benaya is telling me that she's choshevet she'amatzav she'ani meta'er yoter murkab bechina historia. Of course, it's muter murkab. That's why I was saying that it was broad strokes and very simple. Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I'm very happy. She's saying that in all of the Islamic regions, the Jews experienced the Enlightenment and modern thought because of the colonialist regime or establishment of the West. I think that there's a very big difference between being ruled by the imperial West and living immersed in the hub and culture. And I think that it affected us very, very differently. So while I say, yes, I think you're right that they were touched by it and that there was an element of it, it wasn't Germany. It wasn't France. It wasn't that level of rupture and shift of paradigm. Again, that's my perspective, my understanding, and my personal study of the issues. And I think that had a huge difference in terms of how it was that it affected us. Yeah. So you're saying that you've had experiences that I had mentioned, in terms of the relationship. So for Atara, who's asking for an email, you can send any emails that you need to send to Rabbi Dweck, DWECK, at Sephardi, SEPHARDI.org.uk, and that's for anybody needs to send anything to me. Did Hacham Ovadia not live and teach extremes? No, I don't think he did. I think that Hacham Ovadia did, I will say, I think that he did lean towards Haredi Ashkenazi realms. And I think that the reason that happened was for the reason that I mentioned. Hacham Ovadia was not a man of the Enlightenment. And Hacham Ovadia was not a man of the West. And there was profound influence on him to conform. And as much as he stood very strongly for the pride and strength of Sephardi approach to psak halacha, which I think that he definitely did stand differently. I mean, his piskei din, his psak halacha was very, very different. I don't know if I told this story, but in Los Angeles, again, for those of you who might be living in Los Angeles or are familiar with it, Rabbi Zalman Uri, alav shalom, was the head of the Bureau of Jewish Education, which had to do with, kind of looking over the day schools. And in Los Angeles, Torah life was very much founded by Rav Simcha Wasserman. Rav Simcha Wasserman was the son of Rav Elchanan Wasserman. Rav Elchanan Wasserman was a Talmid Muvhak of the Chafetz Chaim, the Mishnah Brura. And Rav Simcha, when Chacham Ovadia first visited Los Angeles in 1975, which was just a few months after he became the Rishon Tzion, Rav Simcha put on a Malave Malka. He held a Malave Malka for Chacham Ovadia on Motzei Shabbat. And he was sitting with Rav Zalman Uri and Rav Simcha Wasserman. And the story that I'm telling you was told to me secondhand by a man who saw it firsthand. So Hacham Ovadia was sitting at the table of Rav Simcha, and all night people were coming up to Hacham Ovadia and asking him questions from all areas of halacha, from all areas of Jewish law. And he was answering them right on the spot. Every question that was asked him, he would answer. And at one point, Rav Zalman Uri turned to Rav Simcha and said, how is it that he is answering these questions so clearly, so straightforward, and so outright on the spot, without any pilpul, without any back and forth, without any discussion. How come he's not going through the somersaults that we normally would go through in order to be able to answer these questions? Listen to what Rab Simcha answered. Rab Simcha said he never had to sharpen his knife on the grindstone of Haskalah. And for Hacham Ovadia, that was good in that sense because he was just straightforward. He didn't go through all of the ups and downs that one would need to intellectually go through, the intellectual calisthenics that the Enlightenment demanded. He just said, this is the halacha, and that's it. So that was good in terms of his psak halacha, but there were things missing. And I say that with the greatest of kavod and love for the Rav. But there were things missing. And so there was a strong conformity towards Ashkenazi ways, that the Rav chose to do because he felt that without that, and again, I'm not justifying it or not justifying it, but what he chose to do because he felt that without that, there would be a complete sidelining of the Sfaradim and his involvement in things and so on. And as it was, there was a tremendous amount of sidelining. I mean, I can't tell you the things that I heard in the house about how it was he was treated by others, but nonetheless, I hope that helps a bit. But Chacham Ovadiah's derech psak was very much oriented towards leniency, very much oriented towards affirming life and the ability for people to live as broad and rich a life as possible and not to restrict too much on them. He said to me more than once, when I got my smecha, he said, Rabbi Yosef, the Torah says, V'hai bahem, that the mitzvot were given to us to live by. You must not restrict on people too much. They have to live their lives. The Torah is not there to restrict them. It's there to be able to empower them. That was Chacham Ovadia. And that's very much in line with our Sephardi approach. Yeah.
Rabbi, I think I have one or two questions here that didn't go directly to you, so I'll read them out very quick.
Yeah.
One from Janine. What of the impact culturally and otherwise of the Western Sephardim who came to New Amsterdam, New York, and the converso Sephardim who landed on the shores of Americas with Columbus? What was their impact in America?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a wonderful question. I think that the initial impact was that Jewish life in America was integrated. There was a desire from the very, very beginning that, among those Jews, as was tradition for them, to integrate into society and into life and to lend a hand in terms of the building of whether it was fighting, in the revolution or whether it was building business and so on. And that became very much the way that the founding Jewish presence in that place was. And so I think that was a strong American tradition in mainstream Jewish life for a very, very long time until today. I think that, the Haredi influence later on had its own effects, but I think that essentially Jewish life in the country took great advantage of the freedom of religion, and that there was a tremendous sense of investment in the life of the country. And that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the case that, the Sephardim of the West came in and were among the first Jews to live there.
One other question here I don't think you got. Understanding history, considering that the general Sephardic approach is to welcome Jews regardless of level of observance, how did the Takana come about to ban conversions in some communities? How did this affect the respective communities' interactions with non-Jews in those areas, if at all?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's mainly a Syrian thing, right? The Syrian community from Aleppo. And the reason why that was established was because there was a tremendous concern around intermarriage, because there was an openness among the community or within the community for their children to integrate into society. So, especially when, my father's generation, he was born in 1939, Alav Shalom, that generation, the generation before it, wanted to Americanize very much. As a matter of fact, a friend of mine and a major philanthropist in the community, Joe Sitt, S-I-T-T, produced a series of films just chronicling the development of the Syrian community, which, are wonderful if you haven't seen them. I would actually, very much suggest to the Brotherhood, I don't know that you screen things, but it's worth getting in touch with Joe. I can help you with that. But if you were interested in kind of screening that, but there was a very strong um, drive in the Syrian community in the early days upon arriving to America to integrate into American life and to embrace American culture. Um, and the rabbis and the leaders of the community encouraged that on the one hand, and were quite tolerant of it on the one hand, right? They knew that people were working on Shabbat, and they turned a blind eye. They just said, but come to shul in the morning, or make sure that you make kiddush. But at the same time, they were tremendously afraid of intermarriage. And so that was their way to deal with intermarriage. Unfortunately, it got to be quite extreme, this ban. And it became very cultural. It became very customary to just not accept converts. But what it ended up affecting was, on the positive side, there was less than 1% intermarriage till today in the Syrian community. On the challenging side is that it created a very insular community. And so, that its impetus was because of the openness of the community, but it created a certain closing off, a certain, insularity that the community now, there are changes that are happening internally as a result of that, but we shall see how that develops.
Last question, because we know we're a little running over, but I think this is a really important one, asked by someone from the audience. She mentions that her family is from Tunisia, but Israelis insist that she's not Sephardic but Mizrahi, which you also somewhat alluded to. Would you say you should consider yourself Sephardic, or what would your perspective be, more importantly, on kind of this Sephardic, Mizrahi, Middle Eastern divide, if there is one?
Yeah. I'm going to read you a paragraph that I wrote about that. And I happen to have it at hand, so I'll read it to you, because I think that it's very important to understand that when we use terms, how it is that we're using terms. And you can either use terms in their most specific sense, or you can use terms in terms of their broader treatment. And when I use Sephardi, I alluded to it because I recognize that I'm using it in the vernacular. But I wrote in my essay, addressing these things, the term Sephardic today stands for many rich and varied cultures and backgrounds. In the vernacular, it's been reduced to refer to anyone who is an Ashkenazic. In its proper sense, it refers to Jews whose ancestry resided in the Iberian Peninsula. In its more generic meaning, it refers to Jews who come from a wide geographical range, including but not limited to Western Europe, Middle East, and North Africa. The Sephardic perspective that I represent when I'm speaking generally is the broad generic term. So it's possible that as a Tunisian Jew, I don't know this, and you don't necessarily know this, but it's possible that as a Tunisian Jew, either your family was indigenous to Tunis and didn't originate in Spain or Portugal or the Iberian Peninsula, but it is not unthinkable that perhaps there were some Sephardim that ended up coming. I don't know personally the specific history of Tunisia, but there were many regions in the Middle Eastern, in the Mediterranean basin, in the Middle Eastern communities, where you had, like, for example, in Halab, you had indigenous Jews that had been there from the time of David HaMelech and really never left. And you had Jews that came from Spain and Portugal to live in Halab. So my family happens to be Spanish in their origin. The Dweck family and the Fallis, which was the Paredes family, came from Spain. But there were families, and we know which families. There were families that had always lived there. They were indigenous. So were they technically Sephardim? No. As a matter of fact, for many generations, the Sephardim, the Spaniards, and the indigenous people in Halab didn't mix. But as a result, after time, that mixed. And that was common in many of the various communities. Around Hanukkah, so I'll say in the Syrian community, the Spanish families that kept minhag properly know they're Spanish because we light an extra light on Hanukkah every night. And the reason why we do that is because we came to Halab around Hanukkah time, and we lit that extra light as a recognition of thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for bringing us to safe shores away from the explosion. So, that's one way that we know. So in terms of your question, I don't know what the history of the family is. So if you want to be technical about it, if your family didn't originate from Spain and Portugal and from the Iberian Peninsula, we don't technically call that person a Sephardi. We'll say they're a Dota Mizrach or whatever it is. But the beauty of this whole thing is that we will generally refer to everyone from that area as Sephardi because the influence of the Spanish Jews was so profound and so and permeated so much the culture of that whole region that we just call ourselves Sephardim in general. And I don't think that that's terrible. You know, obviously, if you want to be a stickler and get technical, then you can.
Okay, with that, I want to thank you all so much for joining us these past few weeks with Rabbi Dweck. I want to thank Rabbi Dweck so much for taking the time out of his incredibly busy schedule as senior rabbi of the S&P Sephardi community UK. It's such an honor to have you really for the first time, what God willing will be many future times, you'll join us back again with the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America. As a reminder to you all, we do appreciate any support you can give. We put into the chat a link to directly donate through our end of the year campaign, as well as the brief survey we also asked you to fill out. We'd love to hear your input on this past couple of weeks. Again, if you're interested also in learning more about the Sephardic Brotherhood and our other courses online, please check out our website at sephardicbrotherhood.com. Rabbi Dweck, thank you so much again. Everyone, have a wonderful week. Hanukkah Alegre to those of you who are celebrating, and have a happy, healthy, God willing, safe Hanukkah. Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Thank you. Good night.